Welcome to the new Kevin Smith Great Witness show, the New Adventure series is. And we have Kevin Smith from the UK today here describing and sharing his real side experiences so we can benefit from to become more aware of how we are existing in this creation as multidimensional beings. And his experiences demonstrate how we can move around in creation. We're more than the physical body, and we can, through becoming more aware of our dreams and real side experiences, we can become more aware. So that's why we're here. And welcome, Kevin.
This experience would begin as a view from what I call the between state, then would transition onto the real side, but in fact, by my impressions, would be the same experience, just viewed from these two different awareness positional perspectives. For what we have is a consciousness that when the awareness is placed within, we perceive the simulation it effects through the apparatus of the physical body. The physical body is like the virtual reality headset that contains the game, which would be our decided game, our created consciousness. The mechanics of the physical body then converts the consciousness, decoding the idea agreements the consciousness consists of, into sequences of events and experiences as perceived through the senses, like having a game downloaded to our computer, then experiencing it on the monitor screen. As the computer decodes the data, the ideas of the gamer's construction into the visuals. With virtual reality games, and especially with the creational simulators, which are the same basic principle, we have a far more immersive experience. And were we to have remembered putting on the virtual reality headset originally, stepping into the creational simulators for the first time, we would more likely be more objective to our simulated experience, as we would realize that it isn't real, and simply designed for the purposes of recognizing the ease from the comparisons that creation in its entirety and all its endless expression of experience provides. But of course, that would have been many lifetimes ago, and with each lifetime having us in a new physical vehicle with a new memory body devoid of references, so we are unconscious each lifetime around of all that we have been through and that our consciousness comprises of. So until the moment comes when we do connect with the real awareness, we rather are of the consideration that we are the consciousness, the personal self, and have no recognition of how it is just a created vehicle, and had forgotten then why we came into creation in the first place. And with the simulators being fully immersive computer-type games, it's all rather easy and understandable to be lost in the illusions we create. When we move beyond the consciousness while in creation, effectively taking off the virtual reality headset and exiting the game, we call this going to sleep. But in reality, our awareness now is liberated from the consciousness and onto the real side, where potentially we are not resigned to just our consciousness computer game, limited to the way consciousness has decided as to cause and effect time phases, where each idea of the consciousness generates the experience in sequences that we have to sit through the movie of each lifetime from start to finish. For on the real side, and in reality, there is no time, and so potentially we can see, be, and explore anything of the simulation that we wish to see, without having to go through a process of laborious idea causes that takes us to the effects we wish to experience, of point-to-point motion, limitation of motion, of distance, and various other decided laws of physics, agreed to ideas of our physical level arena. As in reality, we are the same overall awareness, so we are the same overall consciousness that generates the simulation, and through an awareness that moves from the consciousness of our personally created game, can we see anything that the simulation comprises of, irrespective of when or where it took place, as the awareness is this isness reality, where, as the definition of the reference implies, must contain everything. Although our experience is always what we decide, and those that have not made the connection to the real awareness, even though they move their awareness from the consciousness when the body vehicle sleeps, because they are convinced as to their consciousness being what they are, and so are very attached to its construction, so they will resign themselves generally to their personal consciousness and sit in the illusions of it on the real side, although still they will have more freedom from the physical level awareness view, as the decided virtual reality physical level game rolls out the lifetime through the cause and effect mechanics. But agreement with the consciousness alone can't have an individual seeing much beyond that which the consciousness comprises of, unless they make different decisions and choices. But with most being very routine and content with being so, where the personal self-comfort zones of what is familiar are preferable, so will then awareness be retained with what an individual knows, what their consciousness comprises of, and to get through creation, to eventually stand in recognition of the real awareness that we are, does require a process of continually becoming more aware than what we currently are, and that must involve then stepping beyond the routines of the consciousness as it currently stands, and indeed to step beyond the agreement of it, that the real awareness can show the personal self the entirety of creation, which is necessary for complete awareness to be so, the awareness of everything. For anything we are unaware of, we are the unconscious effects of. So this facing of everything creational must be so. Then, through what is shown to the personal self, the simulation of everything creational, do we have the comparisons the real awareness needs to recognize the is by, as is the purpose of the personal self, as a tool for this real purpose. So really, what we see experience-wise is based on what we decide, the extent to which we resign ourselves to the consciousness, or are open to the exploration of more, and the extent to how much we take the risk to see the unknown, and all the positions in creation where we place our awareness, all are vehicles for the awareness to operate through and to have the corresponding view and experience. When it comes to the in-between state position, it is as though the awareness is bridging two positions, the vehicle of the consciousness and the decoding mechanisms of it through the physical body senses, and the real side of unlimited creational explorational potential beyond the consciousness. As such, one will have the decided physical level arena as the predominant scene, but elements of the real side that normally we wouldn't perceive with an awareness locked into the physical vehicle consciousness, bleeding over and into the physical level simulation. As with everything we experience, we are the deciders through our agreements, and so, just as the physical level experience is based on our consciousness and our decided construction of it, so will what we see on the real side, and indeed what of it that bleeds over onto the physical, as we have our awareness bridging the two positions, be according to agreements also, that we are consciously making, or that we are unconscious of, which is the bulk of our consciousness, the subconscious, and with the consciousness very much intertwined and interconnected with the overall consciousness, the endless lifetimes of agreements, the overall consciousness agreement being to the controllers and their power over us, so we can expect to have all manner of experiences on the physical, on the real side, and the between state that we would rather not be having, but that these subconscious agreements permit. Were I to go fully onto the real side, I would have not just elements of it bleeding over onto the physical, but the entirety of the simulated environment and situation that the elements are associated with. And so generally, if we begin in the between state, what happens in it may be more difficult to understand as to its nature, as it's like seeing only a slither of the movie we are trying to watch. But if we transition onto the real side fully, while in the midst of the between state experience, we then will be seeing the entirety of what's taking place, that the elements bleeding over are a part of, or at least the entirety of what we have decided to see on the real side, as we always see to the extent that we decide. In this experience then, in the between state, I would have another of my grey alien visitations. These I have recounted before, whereas I retain my between state, agreements facilitate the presence of the greys that operate from the real side, but rather bleed over onto the physical, and often I will see them partially embedded in the walls, etc., as the physical level rather overlaps the position the aliens are occupying. On the real side, we would expect to see them then in whatever environment would be present there. The majority of my grey alien encounters from this between state have been beneficial, making sense with life. The aliens that are stepping up and are also with the real guides. And so, what they are doing in the various experiences I have reported, from portal making to adjustments of my physical body, are all overall awareness beneficial. But among the beneficial experiences would be those that are quite the opposite, as my agreements perhaps are extensive in regards to the greys as a species seemingly, and include the more notorious dark force and personal self agenda driven variety, or perhaps backdoor agreements. For as I agree with the beneficial aliens, and as they will have agreements through their consciousness with others of their kind, including the bad ones, so as I agree with the stepping up greys, do I open myself up to others that they have agreements with also. This is why facing life and creation has the unavoidable additional effect that are these open doors to the dark forces and all manner of creatures and beings, with the consciousness of agreements being so interconnected and interwoven as it is. On this occasion, the grey alien, partially embedded in my wall, from my between state position and view, had seemingly insidious intentions, as were my real awareness impressions. Were it not for my real awareness connection, I would have to rely on the visuals of the experience alone, and the personal self-determination then of the situation wouldn't include the intent of the grey, as all it would see was the simulation of the situation, whereas the real awareness through all creation and consciousness as it is can determine every idea, thought, emotion, agenda, and intent that each encountered being harbours. And again, with the detail lacking, as the full extent of what was taking place was on the real side, based on just the presence of the grey alien, very little seemed to be taking place. So it fell on my real awareness that impressions not only were provided as to this grey's intent, but as to what was taking place. This grey seemed to be attempting to damage, disrupt, or affect my consciousness adversely in some manipulative way that was hard to fully determine, again through agreements that he could do so. But curiously, this seemed to not have worked as intended for him, as instead of being adversely impacted, it seemed I was somehow enhanced, as though my consciousness was adjusted, but in a way that was not detrimental, but may actually be beneficial. The grey alien would depart after a few moments. Perhaps he had abandoned his efforts, and so, as I explained earlier, I would have the limited between-state view of the situation infused with real awareness, additional impressions, as it were, but a real side view that would be simultaneously occurring and ought provide more clarity as to the situation, visually at any rate. So I rather chased the experience, followed it through, and moved my awareness onto the real side. For again, it's not as though we need concern ourselves with the time, for in reality and on the real side of life, in the isness everything position, every experience is present, and we can revisit experiences regardless of when or where they took place in creation. But if we delay between the between-state experience and the real side version, there lies the possibility we may consider, focus on, have our attention diverted to other ideas, that we don't then have a clarification of the between-state experience. We may have instead a completely random other experience that is unrelated. So in such a situation, an immediate transition from one position to the next is essential. And so I found myself walking with my brother Gary, although my impressions were that he was a real guide. As often, the forms the guides assume are of older siblings, and this is certainly the case with me, as very often guides will be in my brother Gary's form, and the real awareness will discern the unmistakable reality of their is standing beingness, and also will their actions always make sense with life and awareness, as opposed to the actual individual who is in the role of my brother in this lifetime, whose deeds and behaviours would be completely personal, self-serving. I would accompany the guide. We would be walking through streets, but it's as though they were warping, bending, as though the consciousness that made up their construction was rather unstable. This is in fact a symptom of a simulator nearing its end. For as the overall consciousness becomes as compacted as it is, it starts to impact in on itself, starts to destabilize, like a computer carrying too much data and overloading, and this in turn effects into a simulator that impacts in on itself and ultimately implodes. We approached now a large portal, as I rather staggered up the street that was weaving and undulating like an ocean. I experienced a large portal such as this recently, where I recounted a large group and I heading toward it and vacating the streets and cities which represented the consciousness as it currently stood, as the simulation on the physical as it is must be the current effect of the overall consciousness. So whatever we see in the world today, as marketed as it is, as being the pinnacle of human achievement, must be in fact the pinnacle of consciousness constriction and distortion as it currently stands. With that previous portal experience, it was as though we were presented with alternative options and opportunities that reflected our intent, our decision to become ever more aware, as our experience is always our intent and what we decide. So, to want to be and see more must herald more opportunities that we can move from the effect simulation of our current positioning, portals to alternative places in creation, or symbolic of the transition from what we know and into what we don't, the unknown that the portal could represent. But I rather knew that the guide was taking me to the real side experience of that which I only had partial imagery of from my between state position earlier, as was then my want and intent to see more in regards to this, and as it evidently made sense with life for me to see it, so life then would deliver, the real guide escorting me to where I needed to go, possibly to ensure I get there and don't get distracted by something else that claims my attention. The scene switched, and now I was in a kind of stone arena. I would be in the company of another individual, and so this scene, the presence of this other individual, were not features that bled over from the real side to the physical during the between state experience. The other individual was on his respective awareness process also, as was my impression, although I didn't determine his identity. And so we both had agreements that had facilitated this experience, and had permitted the inclusion of other beings in our simulation also, the specific beings in question hovering above us, numbering 3, and yes, they were beings of ill intent, but curiously they were not greys, but their forms were such that didn't make sense to my personal self, to the extent that I simply couldn't describe them. Perhaps they were the greys, but in alternative, shape-shifting forms. Or maybe these were altogether different beings, one of which, the one I saw from my between state, assuming a grey form, just to have my assuming the greys were the guilty party, a case of misrepresentation and misdirection as to the actual beings responsible, whatever these beings, or rather their body types in fact were. But it was along similar lines. Agreement somewhere facilitated their presence in the experience of myself and this other individual, and their intent was to adversely affect our consciousness in a way that would be disruptive to our awareness process. For although they, or any being, can't touch the real awareness, disrupting the personal self that we need to operate for our process of awareness and to get through a creation and recognize the is with, could be detrimentally impacting to our processes. But just like in the between state view and impressions, what was supposed to be a detrimental sabotaging had rather the different outcome. As I said, my impressions were of an enhancement somehow, for these beings had remarkable, albeit unbeneficially utilized, etheric, creational, manipulating abilities, and their attempted disruption of our consciousnesses through agreements that extended to them and thus allowed such interference, resulted in fact in our own creational manipulating abilities being heightened. For now we both seemed to have the ability to generate and harness a curious blue energy of a kind that had all manner of potential as to its applications. Through the real awareness on the real side, we have potentially access to everything we need anyway, as we always will have what we need in every moment that makes sense with life, and according to the situations we find ourselves in. For as we stand in the real awareness, so we stand in the true reality that supports us, and a true reality isness that supports the real awareness that it is, will always provide what is required for the simulated personal self of the real awareness that animates it and has decided to recognize the isness that it is. So really, we don't need to chase phenomena or access the abilities of the ethereal self, or if we do happen to open up these capabilities, we ought endeavour to only utilize them in ways that make sense with life, are beneficial, and are not personal self-serving. So could it be that perhaps the ill intentions of these beings to disrupt went according to plan, that they intended to unlock these abilities in us, that perhaps we might be distracted in the phenomena of what we could now do through the ethereal vehicle? All too easy to lose a focus when it comes to the psychic sciences, and then generate unnecessary effects and karma we then have to deal with, as we lose ourselves in the illusions of phenomena, agree then with the consciousness, and fall back into the personal self through the chasing of these ideas. But regardless of if this was according to plan or not, it seemed these beings wanted now to destroy us, so perhaps suggesting what they intended was not what had transpired. Despite our agreements allowing then this experience to be so, perhaps even this had been an experience we had deliberately effected, that we could be shown another occurrence in creation, that we could then share this with others, and overall benefit awareness by doing so. For as we face creation, we will have all these various experiences, from pleasant to abhorrent. We will have the confrontations. But if our real intent is maintained, we can get through it, as we always are fine as long as we hold to this real intent. For as we are our intent, but it takes the process it does for the personal self to be taken through the experiences it needs, as we hold to the real intent, the simulation of the experiences, to the culmination of our process of is recognition will unfold as it will, and we need not be overly concerned with the particulars of what is all illusion anyway. And so perhaps we might think we have all these various subconscious agreements and attachments that are constantly having us in adverse situations, and this can be so, but it's more that we are willing and prepared to go through such experiences that we become more aware and can share with others that they benefit awareness-wise also. As for this consciousness alteration and blue energy, who can say how that will manifest itself? But as long as the real intent is held to, and the focus is with the ears, what happens with the personal self is very secondary. And just as these beings moved in to destroy us, my companion and I simply faded from the scene and beyond their reach. So, regardless of what circumstances had us in that situation, be they subconscious agreements, or part of the going through of creation, the facing of everything, or just experiences generated deliberately that certain things are revealed and can be shared, we evidently were not resigned to the effects. We clearly were not clinging on to anything agreement-wise that could have these beings exact their destructive intentions. We moved into the real awareness standing aside from all creational ideas, and with no idea clung to. We therefore could not be in the simulated effects of anything, and so were beyond any simulated experience these beings could impose upon, as we had retracted agreements from the ideas that they were, and there was a brief real side experience and view several nights prior to what I have just recounted, where another being was in my house, on the real side, on the ground floor, which represented personal self-agreements that facilitated its presence, conscious agreements based on its position in the house, but maybe inadvertent conscious agreements, backdoor agreements, that through the agreements consciously to others, that this being also had access to my personal self-house and experience. For this being, and again its form indeterminable, seemed to be one of considerable ability and creational manipulating skill, and like the curious being from the Egyptian-looking temple I shared previously, and with the beings I would encounter several nights later that I have just recounted, its intentions were malign. It does seem this is the current flavour of my real side experiences recently, of drawing the attentions of these powerful beings, and I would have a third-person perspective view, as I watched my personal self and this being. So this was a real awareness overview of this situation. For this being was claiming it had the ability to control my personal self like a puppet, that it could manipulate it in any way it so chose, and indeed would exercise this apparent control over my personal self, as I watched from my real awareness view and position. My impression was that its ability to directly control and possess the personal self wasn't as absolute as it claimed, though evidently it had this kind of skill to a degree, again as much as my agreement parameters through the personal self would allow, and as this being initially made my personal self rather dance like a puppet, it's as though the recognition of the agreements maintained that allowed this were withdrawn, and this being lost its ability to do anything, would seem disgruntled, and fade from my house. So it's possible this being was one of the three from the stone temple, or a similar kind of creature to them that featured in the experience I would have several nights later. And the overall takeaway would be then that yes, there are beings in creation with remarkable abilities and skills, most of which, as is generally the case with personal self immersed, unaware, and unconscious individuals, that they use these abilities for self-serving purposes, for agendas, in ways that don't make sense with life. And generally, it seems, it is the temptation for those that do develop these abilities to use them destructively and abrasively. And as I said, I seem to be drawing the attention of these kind of beings in recent weeks. But as is always the case, we are the deciders always of our experience. It's only the ideas we agree to that allow any imposition into our experience to be possible. And yes, the subconscious agreements will still play a factor as we continue to go through creation and the personal self, facing all the tap lines and releasing them. But despite these agreements that allow the presence of these beings and their mischief, we can always deal with it if we maintain our focus with the ears and our connection with the real awareness, as it's all about facing everything after all, and that would include all these types of characters. And there is opportunity there also, for as they step into our experience, they become aware of that which we represent and have our intent with. The ears references will become known to them by default, and every being is in the same life and struggling to wake up to the reality of the real awareness that they are. So any attention we get, as adverse and abrasive as it is, can't really be unwelcome, as the dark forces and the ill-intended will benefit from encroaching into our experience as they learn of the ears references therefore, even if they don't at this moment recognize the benefit for themselves. But the seed would have been planted, if only subconsciously, at this time, and ideally we would present them directly with the opportunity of the ears to work with any situation that it is beneficial awareness speaking, but not always would such characters be likely to accept what we have to present. And so we can be subtle, we can hint, we can gauge how far we can go. But even if we don't, as I said, there is no way any individual can enter our experience and not pick up something of the ears references that we are promoting, if only subconsciously, if that is indeed what our overall intent and life is about. Duane, the great writer, responded to this real side experience at the time of the sharing of it, and I quote, You're having fun confronting these people, little by little. That's all we can do. We learn to confront everything as everyone steps up. We continue to do what we do, whereas most other people in the world are doing what they are. But we will have our voice, and we're going to make more sense than everybody eventually. It takes a few minutes, but we're doing it.
And I've got a few notes here from what you talked about, Kevin. They're kind of random, but I'll just, because you said a lot, so I just jotted down certain things. One was with creation breaks up the awareness so we can see it from different viewpoints. So we're all aware, we're all awareness, but creation breaks it up, this awareness, so it can see itself from different viewpoints, meaning from different body types and different experiences. So it can gain a larger viewpoint of itself. And then the subconscious body, as we have the planes, Paul had it stacked on one after another, the physical, astral, causal, mental, etheric. Each plane becomes greater than the previous one. So the subconscious is, according to this system, it's the greatest, the biggest, because this area of unconsciousness that we have in creation is vastly, vastly greater than, the conscious part. Physical, the emotional, the mental. So this area is huge, and there's just it's an endless vastness. And then you keep mentioning how we agree to something or somebody, and then actually we become to agree with everything about that person's consciousness. In a way, we agree to the whole thing, the whole package. If we befriend somebody, so, for example, so this I see, if someone's a Christian, you're going back to the beginning of the whole series of experiences and events to Christianity. I mean, you basically are agreeing, not agreeing, but you're seeing, be able to experience all this through this other person who's a Christian, say. So you have access in a way to all these events of Christianity because he agrees or she agrees to it. And then next, we can't understand everything that comes our way, which is okay because it's too much, but we can, through our viewpoints and experiences, we can just gather, more viewpoints and more experiences through what comes our way. So we don't need to understand everything, but it's just a way of gathering things that we can play off of or relate to. Oh, you have to be, this is what Dwayne's been saying lately too, you have to be capable of handling this reality. You can't just be a good person or a good guy or person or knowledgeable of it, that be able to handle it and express it, articulate it. So again, it's the whole package. You have to be able to do the capability part here. Like the real guides are capable. They've earned their position. So that's where we're going to, if we choose. And intent is the most important because it's the most real. So no matter what comes our way, again, it's our intent, because our intent is our real awareness. So we keep that focus, it's going to be okay, no matter what happens to the other bodies. And then my favorite here is not what you think it is. It's never what you think it is. And that's the fun part of this, because you may have a consideration or experience pointing to something, or a viewpoint or an idea, but it's never really what you think it is. It just, all these other things can be references to bring you to the point where you take the risk to go into the unknown and see it for what it is. So it's really, it's never what you think it is. And that's like daily. You can't know what, you just can't know this, because it's always new now. And if you're, like Kevin said, if you're always going into the unknown, I mean, how can you know what it is? How can you know what the unknown is? And that's what's so hard to relating to people, because there's nothing they can relate to that we're talking about, really. We can mock up references and things, but really, in the end, there's nothing that they can relate to. So they actually have to take a leap, almost of faith, to see what we're talking about. And that, for most people, is beyond, you know, what they want to do. It's their comfort zone is too important. Their personal life is too important. So very few people will get this. And that's why the real guides are doing so many things to take advantage of the times we're in. You know, the stresses, the aggravation, suffering that people are in right now, fear, using that to see if anybody want to wake up. Okay, and then maybe Dwayne talks about facing the world leaders. So Kevin, maybe your recent experiences with these powerful, skillful beings are preparing you also to face the world leaders, you know, when that time comes, to see if they would want to do something real for themselves and others. And the last thing is, yes, we can develop any ability we want, make it so through lifetimes of study and practice, but you reach the pinnacle of whatever it is your talent or focus is going to be, music, being a great basketball player, being Michael Jordan or something. So where is he now? You know, like what does that prove, or what does that get him? You know, the experience, but that's not it. There's still more. So what has all this done for him? Who knows? You know, but that's not it either. The skill for people that look so prominent, authorities, etc., look so important. Well, it's whatever. If you don't have this isness, or this perception, or this reality, this awareness, then it's just whatever, you know. Okay, and Peter, do you have anything else?
While we were talking, I'm experiencing I'm experiencing spontaneous guitar, and that's interesting because I'm noticing that I'm capable of creating on the spot, and I don't do it exactly consciously, but I have to be with my real consciousness or my real awareness in order to progress along each step or each part of the song or the theme or whatever's going on in the projection of the music, or in my case at the moment, it's an example. And so I'm experiencing that holistically, let's say in a large way, in other avenues that I'm working with, and I don't know where everything's going to go or develop, but I guess I'll relate that to your Michael Jordan metaphor, because he is probably having to handle a good measure of some of the challenging Black historical African American athletic sports related community and religious Martin Luther King related. In other words, that where he's at is that he has elected himself to be part of that as a major icon of that community. And so whatever's new developing there, he's part of at some level, and other figures as well, LeBron James, Tiger Woods. Those three come to mind because of their high level. And also all of them have gone through a number of controversial, let's say personal events or worldly related in the sports community. And as leaders of those things, they are, or as reflections of the content and the context and the reality of that community and those communities that they're part of, either the religious or the sports or the business. And, you know, all of them went through those challenges. Tiger Woods recently got in another one with his car accident. And previous to that, of course, was with the women and his wife and sexual escapades, etc., romantic situations. And then the next thing, he loses his ability to play golf at some level. He had major back issues and so forth. LeBron James, something different, but again, following a certain kind of transformational path. And I'm relating that because then I'm going to go to the United States. And what's going on now in the United States is this same lower reality, yes, transformational path. Now, whether they're really going to come into what I'm calling the real new age is of the true reality, or stay in their localized community, governmental, political, economic, business agenda process that is being directed by the alienation and the reptilian dynamic, if you want to call it that. At the same time, this is also concurrent with the universal events, and that would be related to movement of the stars and the galaxies and at that level. But in terms of our worldly experience, our universal experience of becoming unified or aware of at least the galactic and universal connection or orientation. This being, okay, and again, we talked about these three levels. And in terms of the three dimensions and what we're dealing with here, these are very exemplary of all of that. There's the human, then there's our group affiliations and worldly affiliations, and then there's the third, the universal. And even when you get to the universal, you go, okay, that's not the real thing. That's not the true reality like this, or the whole of the real universes and the real presentation. How difficult then to be sharing this whole thing at the same time that we know all we can do is make these references and demonstrate or share the examples and experiences in that set of dimensions and come to it. And that's my experience personally. Let's say very simply, you know, I've got this religious and creative musical artist, and then the environmental business idea, let's say, those three things of how to improve the nature of our relation to the natural environment and actually make it a whole demonstration with the natural environment and the true reality, not just working with nature as man knows it. So I guess the artist would be creations of movies and let's say the arts as an example of what New UU presenting with reel to reel or with the historical Jeopardies and Alien Wheel of Fortunes and or whatever other kind of movie video show media example. And then we have the third, which is to be with those that have gone at least to the top of this dimensional picture and said, okay, we know that the real thing is beyond that, beyond this. My image that I use here, this I developed about 20 years ago. I really didn't know what it was when I made it. Actually, I don't even know what I was trying to do when I made it. But what happens a lot of times when you do something is all of a sudden you produce something, you don't even know what you produced, and you say, oh, that's pretty good, I'm going to keep that. And now it's become like a logo image. But I realize that what it really is showing the multi-dimensions and expression of light and sound, and a compilation of a whole picture of the universes. That's all. Just putting it as a whole connection.
Thanks, Peter.
Yep. Thank you too.
Okay, let's go on then, Kevin. Your second experience, unless you want to, any comments on what we said or your first experience?
Well, I just wanted to say briefly, when you said, Val, that it's one of your, you say it's never what you think it is. I mean, that is very often the case when I'm writing up my real side experiences, because I'll have my experience and I'll have an idea of what I think it was about, and I'll begin to write it out. And always initially, I will refer to the references that I already know, that which I'm already aware of. But then very often I'll have a sense as I'm writing it, there'll be a moment of pause as I feel something else coming in. And so what I've come to recognise is that I will then move myself into my real awareness position, and I'll just sit there for a while, and more or less it will be a case of, it would be from the personal self perspective, it would be as though you were blanking the mind and emotions, which you're simply stepping aside from the consciousness of those two-dimensional aspects of the personal self. And then I will have the sense of it coming through, and then the trick is to then be able to recognise it and then be able to define it and apply it to the experience. And so very often what I can, very often when I write my experiences, it's in a sense, it's almost as though sometimes they write themselves, and almost as though it's the real awareness sort of coming through and almost giving you the impressions of what to write about in regards to this. And then sometimes I'll feel almost like the impression to articulate a certain part of it, or explain a certain part of it, or define a certain part of it, and then another time I might define a different part of it. And I sometimes wonder if I sometimes imagine that why a particular bit is I have the sense to define that particular part of it is very possibly because at the moment that I share it, there will be somebody that will benefit from that definition at that moment when I do share it on the Skype, whereas in a completely different situation were I to define that, then perhaps that wouldn't be such a benefit. And so very often I have an impression to write something a certain way or define a certain thing, and because it's the real awareness, the real guides, everything working through the personal self, there'll be certain points where individuals will benefit from hearing a certain thing, and there'll be certain points that they won't be perhaps so receptive to it. And so it's all a matter of timing and things like that. And so very often that is the case as well, I find.
Yeah, like Peter said with his image, it just came to him, and that's why we really encourage people to do something. Once you start doing something, things will come in. You'll get impressions, you'll get what we're talking about. Do something that makes sense, that benefits the whole, and you'll start getting it. Actually, that's the only way to get it. It's like do something, not just sit around meditating or singing new you, but get up and do something, and then it'll happen.
This experience would be an attack of a kind, as I would initially be on the real side, but would transition to a state of awareness I call the in-between place. This is where the awareness is not on the real side, but not quite on the physical either, but rather between the two. What happens when I find my awareness here is that my physical vehicle is still sleeping, its eyes are shut, but despite this, I can see the entirety of my bedroom as though I were awake, and my eyes open. I have no view of what's transpiring on the real side, but in this place, bridging the real side and the physical, I perceive elements and features of the real side manifesting in my room, even individuals of varying intents on occasion. With our ReALL awareness, it is everywhere simultaneously, the physical and the real side, as everything is this isness aliveness. But we decide where our awareness view lies. We zero in on a certain part of creation that we need for whatever comparison, insight, or representation we can glean from doing so. Until we do have this recognition of the is, there is no sense being in this isness everything view. Like how Dwayne says, the guides can take people to the real universes, literally speaking, but if they can't recognize the is, there would be no benefit in doing so. So in the meantime, our awareness remains with created happenings and situations on the physical and on the real side, for our comparisons to recognize the is by. Many times I get impressions of some impending attack, almost like a real awareness alarm bell, even though the specific nature of it can't be determined by my personal self. It's as though the real awareness, or maybe the guides, both of which are this overall isness awareness, determines an impending threat and makes it known to my personal self on the occasions that it does, because we have a personal self, and effectively then we are two selves while in creation. Both must be aligned to the objectives and intents we have, or the results are either lessened or fail to be so, as we can have this rather unproductive tug of war between personal free will intents and real awareness intent. So it's as though the personal self is made privy to these imminent attacks, which generally occur on the real side and through the parts of the self we are not always conscious of, the astral through to the etheric, and it then falls on the personal self to make a decision that allows for the real awareness to then deal with it. Without agreement through the personal self, the hands of the guides, life, the real awareness, this overall awareness isness, are rather tied. With all attacks and impositions on our experience, agreement in some form or another facilitated the potentiality of it. And also, as we face creation and the hand we have had in its construction, we have a confrontation with endless situations and individuals, as our karma is entwined and meshed throughout it all, with many affiliations and connections through all the lifetimes we have lived, despite what we must face and are confronted by, or agreements through the personal self we are unconscious of, that present as windows of attack opportunity. The protection lies through our real intent, our real awareness, as we stand more and more in a reality that is beyond cause and effect, and a real awareness that can better handle creational situations that befall its created self, as we recognize it more and stand in the nowness of the real awareness more so. But still the personal self-decisions can detract from the effectiveness of the real awareness, if they are at odds with the real intent of it, and sometimes the personal self can cling on to agreements that it doesn't realize are allowing specific attack opportunities and adverse situations into our experiences. This was rather the case here, for often when I do find myself in this between state, bridging the physical and the real side, attacks on the real side that were my awareness locked into the personal self on the physical while awake, I wouldn't be able to perceive, though maybe experience the effects in whatever forms they take. In this between position, I can see elements and features of the attack manifest in my very bedroom on the physical, perhaps not always making sense to my personal self, but my real awareness makes it quite apparent through the impressions that whatever is transpiring is an attack of some kind. And then the real awareness must let my personal self decide to receive the assistance the real awareness can afford. In other words, if it is agreement that has allowed this attack, this agreement must be released. Usually, if it is just a confrontation through the process of facing creation, matters just take care of themselves, and we just go through the experience of it, as the facing of creation is very much the real intent and purpose objective embraced, and so we need not concern ourselves with what transpires. On this occasion, I had no forewarning of this attack, as on other occasions, only that I would find myself in this between state, and my room suddenly filled with a dull and seemingly heavy light, which I wouldn't have seen were I fully on the physical with my awareness, as my awareness would have been in the physical body and perceiving the physical level simulation generated through it, through the physical level decoding apparatus, the 5 senses. The personal self could never know what was taking place exactly here, but for impressions gleaned through the real awareness that had me determine that this light somehow was part of an attempt to make some alteration to my created consciousness, and not for beneficial reasons either. It's as though the real awareness waited, poised to act, but could not, because my personal self retained agreements that were allowing this attack, and also my sense was that these agreements were laced with a kind of charged temptation for the personal self that had it hesitate. My impressions were that whatever was occurring, if allowed to continue, could have all manner of dire consequences. Who knew what the dark forces were doing to my consciousness? And although this had no bearing on my real awareness, it could still be disrupting for my process, a process that requires the personal self that was now being tampered with. But sense would prevail. I had the impression of the releasing of tap-line agreements, as the personal self indeed agreed to let them go. For by this time I was feeling as though something was rummaging through my brain, so it felt, more so through the stored reference files my causal and mental bodies contained, with the intent to make alterations, and this was causing great anguish with my personal self. With the agreements released now, however, the personal self now could allow the real awareness to act, as its decision to align with what makes sense with life liberated the real awareness to take care of the necessaries that the personal self's momentary free will reluctance had disallowed. The light faded away, and as I rather scanned through my personal self, I determined no harm was done, and whatever the source of this attack had been, and whatever it was intended to achieve, had failed. Again, everything in our experience is based on agreement. We are always the deciders, and we do rather have to get the personal self out of the way, to forget about it and pay it as little attention as possible. For as was apparent in this experience, what we free will decide through the personal self, what we cling on to tap-line wise, will do nothing but delay our process of awareness, and make it so that our protection through the real awareness is lessened or even made impossible, simply because we have decided through the personal self in such a way that prevents this protection from being so. Protection is only as automatic and assured as we decide our real intent and sincerity for the recognition of the is to be as absolute as the true reality itself is, any less than 100%, and according to the percentages, will be the protection we have. Duane, the great writer, responded to this real side experience at the time of the sharing of it, and I quote, "The world's going to have a hard time keeping up with all the things we're doing. You're like a soldier. It's a whole lot. I've been through so much myself, and every day doing this, I see that it's a whole lot for people. It's not easy, but this is how it is to survive, and we will get through it. While we're here, we're trying to get this agreement, and it's a toughie. But you might say these people have to wake up because they have no alternative. It's at that point, and they're seeing it. But again, we get the adventure. I feel very privileged and fortunate, because again, I wouldn't like to be unaware, as so many people are, and resisting this, and are not interested in waking up even a little bit. Again, this place is such a fallacy, such a fabricated fallacy.
The personal self, I just kind of let it be. You don't have to deny it or abuse it or anything, but just like manage it, you could say, because it doesn't and can't relate to the real awareness or the real universes. But it's in its way, it's necessary for us to relate to the real universes to see what it's not. So it wants what it wants, and it's just very interesting how this relationship is with the personal self and the real awareness. You notice how when people die, sometimes they have their whole life flashing in front of them. Well, that's the personal self trying to capture, relive, or hang on to the experiences it has. But once you let go the physical, then they're whatever again, and you're in your real awareness again, and then you have to deal with your unwillingness to see more and being stuck with your tap lines on the real side. And that's where people wander around on the real side when they leave this planet and don't know where they are, and eventually get pulled back, sucked back into creation through their attachments. So it's very simple in a way, but it's complicated to it's simple and complicated at the same time. It's a paradox, but it's really very simple. Just it's your willingness to wake up and let go of certain things that you thought important. You can still have them, but just be willing to be indifferent to them. If you get what I mean. You can still have it, but be indifferent to it. Be indifferent to not having it or having it. And then you'll be okay. And it's a matter of, like, I'm sure Kevin has his process. I have my process. Peter has his process, like how this awakening happens for each of us individually. We each have our way we do it. It's very unique to everybody, how we wake up. we find something that works for us, like I wouldn't call it a technique, but it's somehow how to manage this relationship with the personal self and the real awareness, and your relationship with this isness, and then how it works for you, and then you just basically ride it out. You just have to have the endurance, the stamina, and patience to ride it out. And no matter what comes to you, deal with it. We see so many people leaving because of some traumatic event in their life, like our friend in Africa, this woman who brought together lots of Africans, but then the government came in and took her property, and she was basically homeless. She'd been doing well. I think she was a realtor. They took everything from her. Her mother died. That was a traumatic event for her. And after that, she left. So it was one of these experiences in the physical where it just threw her. And that's, again, what we have to deal with here. Anything that comes our way, we have to deal with it, because that's just the nature of things. We can't hide in a cave these days. And especially these days, they're going to find you anyway, because they've got that technology. So deal with it, and really you're better off dealing with it than trying to hide or pretend it's not happening. Otherwise, another thing we talk about, there's no guarantees. Anytime, there's no guarantees for anything. So be now, live now, live in the awareness that you are, and you're going to be better off. It's the safest position, you could say, to be in, the most desirable, the most benefit for you to live in your real awareness from that viewpoint. Peter, do you have anything to add?
I'll just add, I noticed that when I'm playing the guitar, I gotta do a lot of different notes in different places on the keyboard, on the fretboard. And you go all the way up to 5th fret, 7th fret, up to the 12th fret. And it's like a dimensional travel all around the universe. But when you get above the 12th fret, then you're going to this next octave, repeat of all the notes at the next level. And that's much more difficult, or it is more difficult to play at the higher level. Just a model, but I was going to share a dream I had just recently of being in New York City, and or in the East Coast city, and the buildings were very strong, and the facades, I mean, marble and metal, and very clean, and I'm going to all these official educational or government or other institutional buildings, and for some reason I'm looking all around for something, I guess, and meeting people or seeing people here and there. And my general observation was I was looking to see if there's anything real here that I could do, and really discovered everything was very real to all the people, but it wasn't real otherwise. And this is my interpretation of this dream. I know that that's what it was. So at the end, I remember getting to, oh, there's one thing I could do. I could go over this. They wouldn't let me into certain places, like they wouldn't let me into the city Hooters restaurant. You had to have a certain a certain amount of money or something to be able to go in these places. And the same was true with trying to participate in different buildings with people. I could see them walking around, senators or government workers and lobbyists, and it was like really like Washington D.C., something like that. And so but I found out, yeah, maybe I could go over to this gambling area or something like that, and I could do something there that might have, that might actually, you know, I could be part of, do something at, you know, and be, you know, have my real experience, you know, of doing something rather than just working or being under the ideas of the solid institutions. So it was very, very imposing in a way. I mean, the city was very, very strong looking buildings, you know, that you're not going to be able to break through this solidity of agreement on what these things are and how real they are and how big and you know, how massive and full of physical dimension. So that was just, I don't know how that relates, but that's what I thought of to share about that experience there.
Well, it's part of the solidification of the personal self, all this, the consciousness of it, and what people have agreed to, you know, during these years here, these lifetimes. So yeah, it's just solid now, to where people are so literal they don't see beyond anything that makes sense. Okay, Kevin?
Thank you, Val.
Yeah, thanks. Anything else, Kevin, today?
Right, that's it for me. I just wanted to say in response to Peter Haslam's experience that he was going into allowed into the gambling casino could very well represent he was willing to take the risk. I imagine that's what that represented.
And the other one, Hooters, you needed a membership, Peter. Annual membership.
Yeah. Well, I meant it was exclusive, you know.
Okay, well, yeah.
Some things were exclusive and you couldn't get in. But I was willing to do anything there. Actually, I was exploring the educational, you know, college, higher learning institution. Definitely, it was a more advanced college, and I was exploring that. And of course, it doesn't really reflect the real, true new university of the real education, but you know, as a reflection of the levels, it was there. I suppose just same thing as on the guitar. You're going through the levels, and most of the work is done at the lower level. But when the player gets up in the higher level, you start becoming more like a Jimi Hendrix, and or whatever, an example, and you know that you're using the full dimensional package, which we need to do. We actually have to be learn these and become adept, and also just to see where our real awareness is at each level, whatever that might be that we're exploring. The thing about keeping the awareness always at the front level is very important. And that's, you know, because the rest of it is all just experiential and referential, and rather than but you can't advance unless you make sure that you maintain your awareness. And that's why I think NUU practice or experience is to keep aware when you're being challenged, as that example, and you know, you just, you know, it doesn't matter what the experience is. Then you just maintain, and progress will ensue because you're in that place, doing NUU as a voice or a chant or a song or just to keep in the in the front. You know, yes, that's real dynamic because you use it, and then it keeps you there. And then after that, you can stay there. You don't need to keep doing exercise or any other kind of practice. It's just it becomes more continuity. And so the dreams become more continuity, and their realism and relation become part of that wholeness, continuity, isness. And that's how I pull that together, I think, somewhat. I'm working on using the practice in a way that I know when I'm really get diverted and projected away from and mentalized, or in whatever other lower body, emotional feeling, etc., that is not it. And you can get pretty far out pretty easily on both sides. We'll say you go way out on the new side too, we'll say, and then it's almost like, well, there's really nothing here, and it's like funny, odd kind of feeling there too on that side. So I think we're not allowed to do that absolutely here. What we're doing is being with the balance and staying with the real without going on polarity and into the dimension forcibly, that is. And to also recognize when we're being misdirected. And so I'm just words for it, but it's my kind of a pretty current experience for me.
Thanks, Peter. Well, let's try the new you, and this is what we use to connect to this reality. Here you are. Peter, you want to sing the new you?
I'll try this one.
Okay. New you. Kevin.
You.
Thanks so much, Kevin, for sharing. And thank you, Peter, for your comments. See you next time.